The Eskimo Twins by Lucy Fitch Perkins. This is the true story of Meanie and Money and their two little dogs, Nip and Tup. Many and Money are twins, and they live far away in the north, near the very edge. They are 5 years old. Meanie is the boy, and Money is the girl, but you cannot tell which is Meanie and which is Money, not even if you look ever so hard at their pictures. That is because they dress alike. When they are a little way off, even their own mother can't always tell, and if she can't, who can? Sometimes the twins almost get mixed up about it themselves, and then it is very hard to know which is Nip and which is Tup, because the little dogs are twins too. Nobody was surprised that the little dogs were twins, because dogs often are. But everybody in the whole village where Meanie and Money live was simply astonished to see twin babies. They had never known of any before in their whole lives. Old Akla, the Angakok, or medicine man of the village, shook his head when he heard about them. He said, "Such a thing never happened here before. Seals and human beings never have twins. There's magic in this." The name of the twins' father was Keshu. If you say it fast, it sounds just like a sneeze. Their mother's name was Cooley. Keshu and Cooley and Meanie and Money and Nip and Tup all lived together in the cold Arctic winter in a little stone hut called an igloo. In the summer, they live in a tent, which they call a tupik. The winters are very long and cold, and what do you think? They have one night there that is 4 whole months long. For 4 long months, while we are having Thanksgiving, and Christmas, and even Lincoln's birthday, the twins never once see the sun. But at last one day in early spring, the sun comes up again out of the sea, looks at the world for a little while, and then goes out of sight again. Each day he stays for a longer time, until after a while he doesn't go out of sight at all. Then there are 4 long months of daylight, when there is never any bedtime. Meanie and Money just go to sleep whenever they feel sleepy. Although many Eskimos think twins bring bad luck, Keshu and Cooley were very glad to have 2 babies. They would have liked it better still if Money had been a boy, too, because boys grow up to hunt and fish and help get food for the family. But Keshu was the best hunter and the best kayak man in the whole village, so he said to Cooley, "I suppose there must be girls in the world. It is no worse for us than for others." So because Keshu was a brave fisherman and strong hunter, and because Cooley was clever in making clothing and shoes out of the skins of the animals which he brought home, the twins had the very best time that little Eskimo children can have. And that is quite a good time, as you will see if you read all about it in this book. The Twins Go Coasting. The Twins Go Coasting. 1. One spring morning, very early, while the moon still shone and everyone else in the village was asleep, Meanie and Money crept out of the dark entrance of their little stone house by the sea. The entrance to their little stone house was long and low like a tunnel. The twins were short and fat, but even if they were short, they could not stand up straight in the tunnel. So they crawled out on all 4s. Nip and Tup came with them. Nip and Tup were on all 4s too, but they had run that way all their lives, so they could go much faster than the twins. They got out first. Then they ran round in circles in the snow and barked at the moon. When Meanie and Money came out of the hole, Tup jumped up to lick Money's face. He bumped her so hard that she fell right into the snowbank by the entrance. Money didn't mind a bit. She just put her 2 fat arms around Tup, and they rolled over together in the snow. Money had on her fur suit with fur hood and mittens, and it was hard to tell which was Money and which was Tup as they tumbled in the snow together. Pretty soon Money picked herself up and shook off the snow. Then Tup shook himself too. Meanie was rolling over and over down the slope in front of the little stone house. His head was between his knees and his hands held his ankles, so he rolled just like a ball. Nip was running round and round him and barking with all his might. They made strange shadows on the snow in the moonlight. "Money," called to Meanie. Meanie straightened himself out at the bottom of the slope, picked himself up, and ran back to her. "What shall we play?" said Money. "Let's get Coco and go to the big rock and slide downhill," said Meanie. "All right," said Money. "You run and get your sled." Meanie had a little sled, which his father had made for him out of driftwood. No other boy in the village had one. Meanie's father had searched the beach for many miles to find driftwood to make this sled. The Eskimos have no wood but driftwood, and it is so precious that it is hardly ever used for anything but big dog sledges or spears or other things which the men must have. Most of the boys had sleds cut from blocks of ice. Minnie's sled was behind the igloo. He ran to get it, and then the twins and the pups, all four, started for Coco's house. Coco's house was clear at the other end of the village, but that was not far away, for there were only 5 igloos in the whole town. First there was the igloo where the twins lived. Next was the home of Akla, the Angakok, and his 2 wives. Then there were 2 igloos where several families lived together. Last of all was the one where Coco and his father and mother and baby brother lived. Coco was 6. He was the twins' best friend. 2. The air was very still. There was not a sound anywhere except the barking of the pups, the voices of Minnie and Money, and the creaking sound of the snow under their feet as they ran. The round moon was sailing through the deep blue sky, and shining so bright it seemed almost as light as day. There was one window in each igloo right over the tunnel entrance, and these windows shone with a dull yellow light. In front of the village lay the sea. It was covered with ice far out from shore. Beyond the ice was the dark water out of which the sun would rise by and by. There was nothing else to be seen in all the twins' world. There were no trees, no bushes even, nothing but the white earth, the shadows of the rocks and the snow-covered igloos, the bright windows and the moon shining over all. 3. Minnie and Money soon reached Coco's igloo. Minnie and Nip got there first. Money came puffing along with Tup just a moment after. Then the twins dropped on their hands and knees in front of Coco's hut and stuck their heads into the tunnel. Nip and Tup stuck their heads in too. They all 4 listened. There was not a sound to be heard except loud snores. The snores came rattling through the tunnel with such a frightful noise that the twins were almost scared. "They sleep out loud, don't they?" whispered Money. "Let's wake them up," Menier whispered back. Then the twins began to bark. Ki-yi, 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 just like little dogs. Nip and Tup began to yelp too. The snores and the yelps met in the middle of the tunnel, and the 2 together made such a dreadful sound that Coco woke up at once. When he heard 4 barks, he knew right away that it must be the twins and the little dogs. So he stuck his head into the other end of the tunnel and called, "Keep still. You'll wake the baby. I'll be there in a minute." Very soon Coco popped out of the black hole. He was dressed in a fur suit and mittens just like the twins. 4. The 3 children went along together toward the big rock. Money rode on the sled, and Minnie and Coco pulled it. The big rock was very straight up and down on one side and long and slanting on the other. The twins were going to coast down the slanting side. They climbed to the top, and Minnie had the first ride. He coasted down on his stomach with his little reindeer skin Kamek's shoes waving in the air. Next Coco had a turn. What do you think he did? He stood straight up on the sled with the leather cord in his hand and slid down that way. But then, you see, he was 6. When Money's turn came, she wanted to go down that way too. But Money said, "No, you'd fall off and bump your nose. You have hardly any nose as it is, and you'd better save it." "I have as much nose as you have, anyway," said Money. "Mine is bigger. I'm a boy," said Money. Coco measured their noses with his finger. "They are just exactly alike," he said. Money turned hers up at Minnie and said, "What did I tell you?" Minnie never said another word about noses. He just changed the subject. He said, "Let's all slide down at once." Coco and Minnie sat down on the sled. Money sat on Minnie. Then they gave a few hitches to the sled, and off they went. Whiz, how they flew! The pups came running after them. In some places where it was very slippery the pups coasted too, but they did not mean to. They did not like it. The sled was almost at the end of the slide when it struck a piece of ice. It flew around sideways and spilled all the children in the snow. Just then Nip and Tup came sliding along behind them. They couldn't stop, so there they all were in a heap together, with the dogs on top. Minnie rolled over and sat up in the snow. He was holding on to the end of his nose. "Aye, aye, aye," he howled. "I bumped my nose on a piece of ice." Money sat up in the snow too. She pointed her fur mitten at Minnie's nose and laughed. "Don't you know you haven't much nose?" she said. "You ought to be more careful of it." Coco kicked his feet in the air and laughed at Minnie, and the little dogs barked. Minnie thought he'd better laugh too. He had just let go of his nose to begin, when all of a sudden the little dogs stopped barking and stood very still. Their hairs stood up on their necks, and they began to growl. "Hark, the dogs see something," said Minnie. Money and Coco stopped laughing and listened. They could not hear anything. They could not see anything. Still Nip and Tup growled. The twins and Coco were children of brave hunters, so, although they were scared, they crept very quietly to the side of the big rock and peeped over. Just that minute there was a dreadful growl. Hoof! It was very loud and very near, and down on the beach a shadow was moving. It was the shadow of a great white bear. He was looking for fish and was cross because everything was frozen, and he could not find any on the beach. The moment they saw him, the twins and Coco turned and ran for home as fast as ever their short legs could go. They did not even stop to get the precious sled. They just ran and ran. Nip and Tup ran too, with their ears back and their little tails stuck straight out behind them. If they had looked back, they would have seen the bear stand up on his hind legs and look after them, then get down on all fours and start toward the big rock on a run. But neither the children nor the little dogs looked back. They just ran with all their might until they reached the twins' igloo. Then they all dived into the tunnel like frightened rabbits. 5. When they came up in the one little room of the igloo at the other end of the tunnel, Keshu and Cooley were just crawling out of the warm fur covers of their bed. Meanie and Monty and Coco and the little dogs all began to talk at once. The moment the twins' father and mother heard the word bear, they jumped off the sleeping bench and began to put on their clothes. They both wore fur trousers and long kamiks with coats of fur, so they looked almost as much alike in their clothes as the twins did in theirs. The mother always wore her hair in a top knot on top of her head, tied with a leather thong. But now she wanted to make the bear think she was a man too, so she pulled it down and let it hang about her face, just as her husband did. In 2 minutes they were ready. Then the father reached for his lance, the mother took her knife, and they all crawled out of the tunnel. The father went first, then the mother, then the 3 children and the pups. At the opening of the tunnel the father stopped and looked all around to see if the bear were near. The dogs in the village knew by this time that some strange animal was about, and the moment Keshu came out into the moonlight and started for the big rock, all the dogs ran too, howling like a pack of wolves. Keshu shouted back to his wife, "There really is a bear. I see him by the big rock," called the others. So she sent Money into the igloo of the Angakok, and Money and Coco into the next huts. She herself screamed, "A bear! A bear!" into the tunnel of Coco's hut. The people in the houses had heard the dogs bark, and were already awake. Soon they came pouring out of their tunnels armed with knives and lances. The women had all let down their hair, just as the twins' mother did. Each one carried her knife. They all ran toward the big rock too. Far ahead they could see the bear, and the dogs bounding along, and Keshu running with his lance in his hand. Then they saw the dogs spring upon the bear. The bear stood up on his hind legs and tried to catch the dogs and crush them in his arms, but the dogs were too nimble. The bear could not catch them. When Keshu came near, the bear gave a great roar and started for him. The brave Keshu stood still with his lance in his hand until the bear got quite near. Then he ran at the bear and plunged the lance into his side. The lance pierced the bear's heart. He groaned, fell to the ground, rolled over, and was still. Then how everybody ran! Coco's mother had her baby in her hood, where Eskimo mothers always carry their babies. She could not run so fast as the others. The Angakok was fat, so he could not keep up, but he waddled along as fast as he could. "Hurry, hurry," he called to his wives. "Bespeak one of his hind legs for me." Minnie and Money and Coco had such short legs they could not go very fast either, so they ran along with the Angakok, and Coco's mother, and Nip and Tup. When they reached the bear they found all the other people crowded around it. Each one stuck his fingers in the bear's blood, and then sucked his fingers. This was because they wanted all bears to know how they longed to kill them. As each one tasted the blood he called out the part of the bear he would like to have. The wives of the Angakok cried, "Give a hind leg to the Angakok." "The kidneys for Coco," cried Coco's mother when she stuck in her finger. "That will make him a great bear hunter when he is big." "And I will have the skin for the twins' bed," said their mother. Keshu promised each one the part he asked for. An Eskimo never keeps the game he kills for himself alone. Everyone in the village has a share. The bear was very large. He was so large that though all the women pulled together, they could not drag the body back to the village. The men laughed at them, but they did not help them. So Cooley ran back for their sledge and harnesses for the dogs. Coco and Minnie helped her catch the dogs and hitch them to the sledge. It took some time to catch them, for the dogs did not want to work. They all ran away, and Tuki, the leader of the team, pretended to be sick. Tuki was the mother of Nip and Tup, and she was a very clever dog. While Cooley and Coco and Minnie were getting the sledge and dog team ready, the rest of the women set to work with their queer crooked knives to take off the bear's skin. The moon set, and the sky was red with the colors of the dawn before this was done. At last the meat was cut in pieces, and Keshu and Coco's father held the dogs, while the women heaped it on the sledge. The dogs wanted the meat. They jumped and howled and tried to get away. When everything was ready, Cooley cracked the whip at the dogs. Tuki ran ahead to her place as leader, the other dogs began to pull, and the whole procession started back to the village, leaving a great red stain on the clean white snow where the bear had been killed. Last of all came the twins and Coco. They had loaded the bear's skin on Minnie's sled. "It's a woman's work to pull the meat home. We men just do the hunting and fishing," Minnie said to Coco. They had heard the men say that. "Yes, we found the bear," Coco answered. "Money can pull the skin home." And though Monty had found the bear just as much as they had, she didn't say a word. She just pulled away on the sled, and they all reached the igloo together just as the round red sun came up out of the sea and threw long blue shadows far across the fields of snow. Cooley divides the meat. Cooley divides the meat. 1. The first thing that was done, after they got the sledge back to the village, was to feed the dogs. The dogs were very hungry. They had smelled the fresh meat for a long time without so much as a bite of it, and they had had nothing to eat for 2 whole days. They jumped about and howled again, and got their harnesses dreadfully tangled. Keshu unharnessed them and gave them some bones, and while they were crunching them and quarreling among themselves, Cooley crawled into the igloo and brought out a bowl. The bowl was made of a hollowed-out stone, and it had water in it. "This is for a charm," said Cooley. "If you each take a sip of water from this bowl, my son will always have good luck in spying bears." She passed the bowl around, and each person took a sip of the water. When Miney's turn came, he took a big mouthful, because he wanted to be very brave indeed, and find a bear every week. But he was in too much of a hurry. The water went down his Sunday throat and choked him. He coughed and strangled, and his face grew red. Cooley thumped him on the back. "That's a poor beginning for a great bear hunter," she said. Everybody laughed at Meanie. Meanie hated to be laughed at. He went away and found Nip and Tup. They wouldn't laugh at him, he knew. He thought he liked dogs better than people anyway. Nip and Tup were trying to get their noses into the circle with the other dogs, but the big dogs snapped at them and drove them away, so Menya got some scraps and fed them. Meanwhile, Cooley stood by the sledge and divided the meat among her neighbors. First she gave one of the hind legs to the wives of the Ungakok, because he always had to have the best of everything. She gave the kidneys to Coco's mother. To each one she gave just the part she had asked for. When each woman had been given her share, Keshu took what was left and put it on the storehouse. The storehouse wasn't really a house at all. It was just a great stone platform standing up on legs, like a giant's table. The meat was placed on the top of it, so the dogs could not reach it, no matter how high they jumped. 2. When the rest of the meat was taken care of, Cooley took the bear's head and carried it into the igloo. All the people followed her. Then Cooley did a queer thing. She placed the head on a bench, with the nose pointing toward the big rock, because the bear had come from that direction. Then she stopped up the nostrils with moss and grease. She greased the bear's mouth, too. "Bears like grease," she said, "and if I stop up his nose like that, bears will never be able to smell anything. Then the hunters can get near and kill them before they know it." You see, Cooley was a great believer in signs and in magic. All the other people were too. She called to the twins, "Come here, Minnie and Monty." The twins had come in with the others, but they were so short they were out of sight in the crowd. They crawled under the elbows of the grown people and stood beside Cooley. "Look, children," she said to them, "your grandfather, who is dead, sent you this bear. He wants you to send him something. In 5 days the bear's spirit will go to the land where your grandfather's spirit lives. What would you like to have the bear's spirit take to your grandfather for a gift?" "I'll send him the little fish that father carved for me out of bones," said Menier. He squirmed through the crowd and got it from a corner of his bed and brought it to his mother. She put it on the bear's head. Moni gave her a leather string with a lucky stone tied to it. Cooley put that on the bear's head too. Then she said, "There, in 5 days' time the bear's spirit will give the shadows of these things to your grandfather. Then we can eat the head, but not until we are sure the bear's spirit has reached the home of the dead." "That is well," the Angakok said to the twins when Cooley had finished. "Your grandfather will be pleased with your presents, I know. Your grandfather was a just man. I knew him well. He always paid great respect to me. Whenever he brought a bear home, he gave me not only a hind leg, but the liver as well. I should not be surprised if he sent the bear this way, knowing how fond I am of bear's liver." The Angakok placed his hand on his stomach and rolled up his eyes. "But times are not what they once were," he went on. "People care now only for their own stomachs. They would rather have the liver themselves than give it to the Angakok. They will be sorry when it is too late." He shook his head and heaved a great sigh. Cooley looked at Keshu. She was very anxious. Keshu went out at once to the storehouse. He climbed to the top and got the liver. By this time all the people had crawled out of the igloo again and were ready to carry home their meat. Keshu ran to the Angakok and gave him the bear's liver. The Angakok handed it to one of his wives to carry. The other one already had the bear's leg. He said to Keshu, "You are a just man, like your father. I know the secrets of the sun, moon, and stars. You know your duty. You shall have your reward." He looked very solemn and waddled away toward his igloo, with the 2 wives behind him carrying the meat. All the rest of the people followed after him and went into their own igloos. Aye, aye, the twins go fishing. The twins go fishing. 1. When the people had all gone away, Meni and Moni sat down on the side of the sledge. Nip and Tup were busy burying bones in the snow. The other dogs had eaten all they wanted to and were now lying down asleep in the sun with their noses on their paws. Everything was still and cold. It was so still you could almost hear the silence, and so bright that the twins had to squint their eyes. In the air there was a faint smell of cooking meat. Meni sniffed. "I'm so hungry I could eat my boots," he said. "There are better things to eat than boots," Moni answered. "What would you like best of everything in the world if you could have it?" "A nice piece of blubber from a walrus or some reindeer tallow," said Mania. "Oh no," Moni cried. "That isn't half as good as reindeer's stomach or fish's eyes. How I love fish's eyes. I tell you, Meanie, let's get something to eat and then go fishing before the sun goes down." "All right," said Meanie. "Let's see if Mother won't give us a piece of bear's fat that is almost as good as blubber or fish's eyes." 2. They dived into the igloo. Their mother was standing beside the oil lamp, putting strands of dried moss into the oil. This lamp was their only stove and their only light. It didn't look much like our stoves. It was just a piece of soapstone, shaped something like a clamshell. It was hollowed out so it would hold the oil. All along the shallow side of the pan there were little tendrils of dried moss, like threads. These were the wicks. Over the fire pan there was a rack, and from the rack a stone pan hung down over the lamp flame. It was tied by leather thongs to the rack. In the pan a piece of bear's meat was simmering. The fire was not big enough to cook it very well, but there was a little steam rising from it, and it made a very good smell for hungry noses. "We're hungry enough to eat our boots," Meni said to his mother. "You must never eat your boots. You have but 1 pair," his mother answered. She pinched Meanie's cheek and laughed at him. Then she cut 2 chunks of fat from a piece of bear's meat which lay on the bench. She gave one to each of the twins. "Eat this, and soon you can have some cooked meat," she said. "It isn't quite done yet." "We don't want to wait for the cooked meat," cried Moni. "We want to go fishing before the sun is gone. Give us more fat, and we'll eat it outside." "You may go fishing if your father will go with you and cut holes for you in the ice," said her mother. Cooley cut off 2 more pieces of fat. The twins took a piece in each hand. Then their mother reached down their own little fishing rods, which were stuck in the walls of the igloo. The twins had bear's meat in both hands. They didn't see how they could manage the fishing rods too. But Menya thought of a way. "I'll show you how," he said to Moni. He held one chunk of meat in his teeth. In his left hand he held the fishing rod. In his right he carried the other piece of meat. Money did exactly what Mania did, and then they crawled down into the tunnel. 3. The twins had some trouble getting out of the tunnel because both their hands were full, and besides the fishing rods kept getting between their legs. When they got outside, they both took great bites of the bear's fat. Keshu was hanging the dogs' harnesses up on a tall pole, where the dogs could not get them. The pole was 8 feet long, and it was made of the tusk of a narwhal. The harnesses were made of walrus thongs, and the dogs would eat them if they had a chance. That was the reason Keshu hung them out of reach. The twins ran to their father at once. They began to tell him that they wanted to go fishing right away before the sun went down, but their mouths were so full they couldn't get the words out. Mani began, chewing with all his might. Then Mani did a shocking thing. She swallowed her meat whole. She was in such hurry. It made a great lump going down her throat. It almost choked her, but she shut her eyes, jerked her head forward, and got it down. "Will you make 2 holes in the ice for us to fish through?" she said. She got the words out first, then she took another bite of meat. "Have you got your lines ready, and anything for bait?" asked their father. By this time, Many had swallowed his mouthful too. He said, "We can take a piece of bear's meat for bait. The lines and hooks are ready." Keshu looked at the lines. The rods were very short. They were made of driftwood with a piece of bone bound to the end by tough thongs. There was a hole in the end of the bone, and through this hole the line was threaded. The line was made of braided reindeer thongs. On the end of the line was a hook carved out of bone. "Your lines are all right," said Keshu. "Come along." He led the way down to the beach. The twins came tumbling after him, and I am sorry to tell you they gobbled their meat all the way. After the twins came Nip and Tup. The ice was very thick. Keshu and the twins and the pups walked out on it quite a distance from the shore. Keshu cut 2 round holes in the ice. One was for Meanie and one for Money. The holes were not big enough for them to fall into. By this time, the twins had eaten all their meat except some small pieces which they saved for bait. They each put a piece of meat on the hook. Then they squatted down on their heels and dropped the hooks into the holes. Keshu went back to the village and left them there. "Don't stay out too long," he called back to them. 4. The twins sat perfectly still for a long time. Nip sat beside Meanie and Tup sat beside Money. It grew colder and colder. The sun began to drop down toward the sea again. At last it rested like a great round red wheel right on the edge of the world. Slowly, slowly it sank until only a little bit of the red rim showed, then that too was gone. Great splashes of red color came up in the sky over the place where it had been. Still the twins sat patiently by their holes. It grew darker and darker. The colors faded. The stars began to twinkle, but the twins did not move. Nip and Tup ran races on the ice and rolled over each other and barked. At last, all of a sudden, there was a fearful jerk on Mani's line. It took her by surprise. The little rod flew right out of her hands. Mani flung herself on her stomach on the ice and caught the rod just as it was going down the hole. She held on hard and pulled like everything. "I believe I've caught a whale," she panted. But she never let go. She got herself right side up on the ice, somehow, and pulled on her line. "Let me pull him in," cried Many. He tried to take her rod. "Get away," screamed Money. "I'll pull in my own fish." Many danced up and down with excitement, still holding his own rod. The pups danced and barked too. Money never looked at any of them. She kept her eyes fixed on the hole and pulled. At last she shrieked, "I've got him, I've got him," and up through the hole came a great big codfish. My, how he did flop around on the ice. Nip and Tup were scared. They ran for home at the first flop. "Let's go home now," said Monty. "I want to show my fine big fish to Mother." But Many said, "Wait a little longer till I catch one. I'll give you one eye out of my fish if you will." Monty waited. She put another piece of meat on her hook and dropped it again into the hole. After a while she said, "You can keep your old eye if you get it. It's so dark, the fish can't see to get themselves caught anyway. I'm cold. I'm going home." Many got up very slowly and pulled up his line. As they turned toward the shore, Monty cried out, "Look, look, the sky is on fire." It looked like it, truly. Great white streamers were flashing from the edge of the world, clear up into the sky. They danced like flames. Sometimes they shot long banners of blue or green fire up to the very stars. Overhead the sky shone red as blood. The stars seemed blotted out. The twins had seen many wonderful things in the sky, but never such color as this. Their eyes grew as round and big and popping as those of Money's codfish, while they watched the long banners join themselves into a great waving curtain of color that hung clear across the heavens. "What is it? Oh, what is it?" they gasped. They were too astonished to move, and they were a good deal frightened, too. They never knew the sky could act like that. Money felt her black hair rise under her little fur hood. She seized Minnie's coat. "Do you suppose the world is going to be burned up?" she said. Just then they heard a voice calling, "Money, Money, where are you?" "Here we are," they answered. Their teeth were chattering with cold and fright, and they ran up the slope and flung themselves into their mother's arms. "Oh, Mother, what is the matter with the sky?" they gasped. Then Cooley looked up too. The long streamers were still flinging themselves up toward the red dome overhead. "We call this the aurora, or northern lights, and know that electricity causes it, but the twins' mother couldn't know that. She told them just what had been told her when she was a little girl. She said, 'That is the dance of the spirits of the dead. Haven't you ever seen it before?' 'Not like this,' said the twins. 'This is so big and so red.' 'The sky is not often so bright,' said Cooley. 'Some say it is the spirits of little children dancing and playing together in the sky. They will not hurt you. You need not be afraid. See how they dance in a ring all around the edge of the world? They look as if they were having fun.' 'It goes around the edge of the world just like the flames around our lamp,' said Minnie. 'Oh, maybe it's the giant's lamp.' Minnie and Money believed in giants. So did their mother. They thought the giants lived in the middle of the great white world, where the snow never melts. The thought of the giants scared them all. The twins gave the fish to their mother, and then they all three scuttled up the snowy slope toward the bright window of their igloo just as fast as they could go. When they got inside, they found some hot bear's meat waiting for them, and Money had both the eyes from her fish to eat. But she gave one to Meanie. When they were warmed and fed, they pulled off their little fur suits, crawled into the piles of warm skins on the sleeping bench, and in 2 minutes were sound asleep. Ivy, the snow house. The snow house. 1. It is very hard to tell what day it is, or what hour in the day, in a place where the days and nights are all mixed up, and where there are no clocks. Minnie and Money had never seen a clock in their whole lives. If they had, they would have thought it was alive, and perhaps would have been afraid of it. But people everywhere in the world get sleepy, so the Eskimos sometimes count their time by sleeps. Instead of saying 5 days ago, they say 5 sleeps ago. The night after the bear was killed, it began to snow. The wind howled around the igloo and piled the snow over it in huge drifts. The dogs were buried under it and had to be dug out, all but Nip and Tup. They stayed inside with the twins and slept in their bed. The twins and their father and mother were glad to stay in the warm hut. At last the snow stopped, the air cleared, and the twins and Keshu went out. Cooley stayed in the igloo. She sat on her sleeping bench upon a pile of soft furs. A bear's skin was stretched up on the wall behind her. She had a cozy nest to work in. The lamp stood on the bench beside her. She was making a beautiful new suit for Minnie. It was made of fawn skin, as soft as velvet, and the hood and sleeves were trimmed with white rabbit's fur. Her thimble was made of ivory, and her needle, too. Her thread was a fine strip of hide. There was a bunch of such thread beside her. Soon Keshu came in, bringing with him a dried fish and a piece of bear's meat from the storehouse. Cooley looked up from her sewing. "Isn't it 5 sleeps since you killed the bear?" she said. Keshu counted on his fingers. "Yes," he said, "it is 5 sleeps." "Then it is time to eat the bear's head," said Cooley. "His spirit is now with our fathers." "Why not have a feast?" said Keshu. "There hasn't been any fresh meat in the village since the bear was killed, and I don't believe the rest have had anything to eat but dried fish. We have plenty of bear's meat still." Cooley hopped down off the bench and put some more moss into the lamp. "You bring in the meat," she said, "and tell the twins to go to all the igloos and invite the people to come at sunset." "All right," Keshu answered, and he went out at once to the storehouse to get the meat. 2. When he came out of the tunnel, Keshu found the twins trying to make a snow house for the dogs. They weren't getting on very well. Keshu could make wonderful snow houses. He had made a beautiful one when the first heavy snows of winter had come, and the family had lived in it while Cooley finished building the stone igloo. The twins had watched him make it. It seemed so easy they were sure they could do it too. Keshu said, "If you will run to all the igloos and tell the people to come at sunset to eat the bear's head, I will help you build the snow house for the dogs." Minnie and Monty couldn't run. Nobody could. The snow was too deep. They went in every step above their knees, but they plowed along and gave their message at each igloo. Everybody was very glad to come, and Coco said, "I'll come right now and stay if you want me to." "Come along," said the twins. They went back to their own house, kicking the snow to make a path. Coco went with them. The snow was just the right kind for a snow house. It packed well and made good blocks. While the twins were away giving the invitations, Keshu carried great pieces of bear's meat into the house. Cooley put in the cooking pan all the meat it would hold, and kept the blaze bright in the lamp underneath to cook it. Then Keshu took his long ivory knife, and went out to help the twins with the snow house, as he had promised. "See, this is the way," he said to them. He took an unbroken patch of snow where no one had stepped. He made a wide sweep of his arm, and marked a circle in the snow with his knife. The circle was just as big as he meant the house to be. Then he cut out blocks of snow from the space inside the circle. He placed these big blocks of snow around the circle on the line he had marked with his knife. When he got the first row done, Minnie said, "I can do that. Let me try." He took the knife and cut out a block. It wasn't nice, and even like his father's blocks. "That will never do," his father said. "Your house will tumble down unless your blocks are true." He made the sides of the block straight by cutting off some of the snow. "Now all the other blocks in this row must be just like this one," he said. Coco tried next. His block was almost right the first time, but then, as I have told you before, Coco was 6. Monty tried the next one. I am sorry to say hers wouldn't do at all. It was dreadfully crooked. They took turns. I cut a new block while Coco placed the last one on the snow wall. Keshu had to put on the top blocks to make the roof. Neither Coco nor Minnie could do it right, though they tried and tried. It is a very hard thing to do. When the blocks were all laid up and the dome finished, Keshu said, "Now, Monty can help pack it with snow." Monty got the snow shovel. The snow shovel was made of 3 flat pieces of wood, sewed together with leather thongs. It had an edge of horn sewed on with thongs too. Monty threw loose snow on the snow house and spatted it down with the back of the shovel. While she was doing this, Minnie and Coco built a tunnel entrance for the dogs, just like the big one on the stone house. They worked so hard they were warm as toast, though it was as cold as our coldest winter weather, and when it was all finished, Minnie ran clear over it, just to show how strong and well-built it was. 3. When the snow house was all ready, Minnie called the 3 big dogs. Tuki was the leader, and the 3 dogs together were Keshu's sledge team. Tuki was a hunting dog too. When Menier called the dogs thought they were going to be harnessed, so they hid behind the igloo and pretended they didn't hear. Coco and Menier followed them, but the moment they got near, the dogs bounded away. They went round to the front of the igloo and ran into the tunnel. Cooley was just turning the meat in the pan with a pointed stick. There was a piece of bear's meat lying on the bench. The dogs smelled the meat. They stuck their heads into the room, and when Cooley's back was turned, Tuki stole the meat. Just then Cooley turned around. She saw Tuki. She shrieked, "Oh, my meat, and whacked Tuki across the nose with the snow stick. But Tuki was bound to have the meat. She ran out of the tunnel with it in her mouth, just as Minnie and Coco got round to the front of the igloo once more. "Aye, aye, aye," they screamed. "Tuki's got the meat." Keshu caught up his dog whip and came running from the storehouse. The other 2 dogs wanted the meat too. They flew at Tuki and snarled and fought with her to get it. Then Cooley's head appeared in the tunnel hole. Tuki was crouching in the snow in front of the tunnel, trying to fight off the other 2 dogs and guard the meat at the same time. She wasn't doing a thing with her tail, but she was very busy with all the rest of her. Her tail was pointed right toward the tunnel. The moment she saw it, Cooley seized the tail with both hands and jerked it like everything. Tuki was so surprised, she yelped, and when she opened her mouth to yelp, of course she dropped the meat. Just at that instant, Keshu's whiplash came singing about the ears of all 3 dogs. Snap, snap, it went. They jumped to get out of the way of the lash. Then Cooley leaped forward and snatched the meat from under their noses and scuttled back with it into the tunnel before you could say, Jack Robinson. It is dangerous to snatch meat away from hungry dogs. If Keshu hadn't been slashing at them with his whip, and if Minnie and Coco hadn't been screaming at them with all their might, so the dogs were nearly distracted, Cooley might have been badly bitten. Just then, Monnie came up with some dried fish. She threw one of the fish over in front of the snow house. The dogs saw it and leaped for it. Then she threw another into the snow hut itself. They went after that. She fed them all with dried fish until they were so full they curled up in the snow house and went to sleep. The feast. The feast. 1. The moment the sun had gone out of sight, all the people in the village came pouring out of their tunnels on their way to the feast at Keshu's house. Keshu's house was so small that it seemed as if all the people could not possibly get into it. But the Eskimos are used to crowding into very small spaces indeed. Sometimes a man and his wife and all his children will live in a space about the size of a big double bed. First, the Angakok came out of his igloo, looking fatter than ever. The Angakok always found plenty to eat somehow. Both his wives were thin. Their faces looked like baked apples, all brown and wrinkled. When they reached Keshu's house, the Angakok went into the tunnel first. Now I can't tell you whether he had grown fatter during the 5 days, or whether the entrance had grown smaller, but this much I know, the Angakok got stuck. He couldn't get himself into the room, no matter how much he tried. He squirmed and wriggled and twisted until his face was very red, and he looked as if he would burst. But there he stayed. Other people had crawled into the tunnel after him. His 2 wives were just behind. Everybody got stuck, of course, because no one could move until the Angakok did. He was just like a cork in the neck of a bottle. Keshu and Cooley and the twins and Nip and Tup were all in the igloo. When they saw the Angakok's face come through the hole, they thought, of course, the rest of him would come too. But it didn't, and the Angakok was mad about it. Why don't they build igloos the way they used to? He growled. Every year the tunnels get smaller and smaller. Am I to remain here forever? He went on. Why doesn't somebody help me? Keshu and Cooley seized him under his arms. They pulled and pulled. The 2 wives pushed him from behind. Aye ye, screamed the Angakok. You will scrape my skin off. He kicked out behind with his feet. His wives backed hastily to get out of the way. That made them bump into Coco's mother, who was just behind them. Her baby was in her hood, and when she backed, the baby's head was bumped on the roof of the tunnel. The baby began to roar. In the tunnel, it sounded like a clap of thunder. The wives of the Angakok and Coco's mother all began to talk at once. And with that and the baby's crying, I suppose there never was a tunnel that held so much noise. It all came into the igloo, and it sounded quite frightful. The twins crept into the farthest corner of the sleeping bench and watched their father and mother and the Angakok with their eyes almost popping out of their heads. Nip and Tup thought they would help a little, so they jumped off the bench and barked at the Angakok. You see, they didn't know he was a great medicine man. They thought maybe he ought not to be there at all. Nip even snapped at the Angakok's ear. That made the Angakok more angry than ever. He reached into the room, seized Nip with one hand, and flung him up onto the sleeping bench. Nip lit on top of Minnie. Now, whether the jerk he gave in throwing Nip did it or not, I cannot say, but at that instant Keshu and Cooley both gave a great pull in front. At the same moment the 2 wives gave a great push behind, and the next moment, after that, there was the Angakok, still red and still angry, sitting on the edge of the sleeping bench in the best place near the fire. Then his 2 wives came crawling through. The Angakok looked at them as if he thought they had made him stick in the tunnel, and had done it on purpose, too. The wives scuttled up onto the sleeping bench and got into the farthest corner of it as fast as they could. The women and children always sat back on the bench at a feast. When Coco's mother came in, the baby was still crying. She climbed up onto the bed with him, and Minnie and Money showed him the pups, and that made the baby laugh again. As fast as they came in, the women and children packed themselves away on the sleeping bench. The men sat along the edge of it with their feet on the floor. 2. The smell of food soon made everybody cheerful. When at last they were all crowded into the room, Cooley placed the bear's head and other pans of meat on the floor. Then she crawled back onto the bench with the other women. The Angakok was the first one to help himself. He reached down and took a large chunk of meat. He held it up to his mouth and took hold of the end with his teeth. Then he sawed off a huge mouthful with his knife. It looked as if he would surely cut off the end of his nose too, but he didn't. When the men had all helped themselves, pieces of meat were handed out to the women and children. Soon they were all eating as if their lives depended on it. And now I think of it, their lives did depend on it, to be sure. I will not speak about their table manners. In fact, they hadn't any to speak of. They had nothing to eat with the meat, not even salt. But it was a great feast to them for all that, and they ate and ate until every scrap was gone. The Angakok grew better-natured every minute. By the time he had eaten all he could hold, he was really quite happy and benevolent. He clasped his hands over his stomach and smiled on everybody. The women chattered in their corner of the sleeping bench, and Cooley showed Coco's mother the new fursuit trimmed with white rabbit skin that she was making for Many, and Coco's mother said she really must make one for Coco just like it. The twins and Coco talked about a trap to catch hares which they meant to make as soon as the long days began again, and the baby went to sleep on a pile of furs in the corner. Many fed the pups with some of his own meat, and gave them each a bone. Nip and Tup buried their bones under the baby, and then went to sleep too. 3. After a while the Angakok turned his face to the wall, as he always did when he meant to tell a story or sing a song. Then he said, "Listen, my children." He called everybody, even the grown-up people, his children. Everybody listened. They always listened when the Angakok spoke. The Angakok knew the secrets of the sun, moon, and stars. He had told them so many times. The people believed it, and it may be that the Angakok really believed it himself, though I have some doubt about that. "Listen, my children," said the Angakok, "and I will tell you wonderful things. There is a world beneath the sea. You catch glimpses of that world yourselves in calm summer weather, when the water is still, and you know that I speak the truth. Then you can see the shadows of rocks and islands and glaciers in the smooth water. Far below you see blue sky and white clouds. That is the calm world in which the spirits of the dead live. I have visited that underworld many times. I have talked there with the spirits of your ancestors." The Angakok paused and looked around to see if everyone was paying attention. Then he went on with his story. "Do you remember how 2 springs ago there were so few walruses and seals along the coast that you nearly died for lack of food and oil?" he said. "My children, it was I who brought the seals and walruses back to you. Without my efforts you might all have starved. I will tell you of the perils of a fearful journey which I undertook for your sakes. Then you will see what you owe to the skill and faithfulness of your Angakok." All the people looked very solemn and nodded their heads. The Angakok went on. "You must know that in the depths of the underworld, far beyond the beautiful abode of the spirits of the dead, lives the old woman of the sea. There she sits, forever and forever, beside a monstrous lamp. Underneath the lamp is a great saucer to catch the oil which drips from it. In that saucer there are whole flocks of seabirds swimming about. All the animals that live in the sea, the whales and walruses, the codfish and the seals, swarm in the saucer of the old woman of the sea. That is where they all come from. Sometimes the old woman of the sea keeps all the creatures in the saucer, or strictly, well, then there are no seal or fish or walrus along our coasts, and there is hunger among the Inuit, human beings. At the time of my journey, she had kept all the creatures for so long a time in her saucer that you and many others were nearly dead for lack of food. It was then that I prepared myself for the perils of this journey to the underworld. I called my Tornak, or guiding spirit, to lead my steps. Without his Tornak, an Angakok can do nothing. The Tornak came at once in answer to my call. He took me by the hand, and we plunged down into the water. First we passed through the beautiful world of spirits, where it is always summer. This part of the way was quite pleasant, but on the farther side of that world we came to a fearful abyss. It could be crossed only on a large slippery wheel, as slippery as ice. I mounted this wheel and was whirled across the chasm. No sooner had I reached the other side than new terrors came upon me. I had to pass by great cauldrons of boiling oil in which seals were swimming about. A misstep would have sent me plunging into the boiling oil, and you would have lost your angakok forever. The thought of this was so dreadful that the angakok paused and wiped his eyes. Then he went on again with his story. However, with great courage I kept upon my way until at last I saw the old woman's house. A deep gulf lay between us and her dwelling, and outside it stood a great dog with bloody jaws. This dog guards the entrance, and he sleeps only for a single moment, once in a very great while. For 6 days I and my tornak waited there for the dog to sleep. At last on the 7th day he closed his eyes. Instantly the tornak seized my hand and drew me across the bridge which spanned the chasm. This bridge was as narrow as a single thread. When we were safely across the bridge, we passed the sleeping dog and boldly entered the old woman's house. The old woman is terrible to look upon. Her hand is the size of a large walrus, and her teeth like the rocks along the coast. The angakok dropped his voice to a whisper. However, when she looked upon me, she trembled, he said. She saw at once that I possessed great power, and was a great angakok. I spoke to her flattering words. I begged that she would send the seal and walrus and seabirds to our coast at once, but she had no mind to yield to my requests. Then I stormed and threatened. The angakok's voice grew louder. My great power prevailed against the mighty sorceress. The seal and walrus swam away. The birds flew into the air and were gone. I had conquered the old woman of the sea. My children were saved. The angakok was silent for a moment. Then he spoke again in a natural voice. When I opened my eyes in my own igloo again, he said, the famine was already over. Flocks of seabirds were flying overhead. The sea swarmed with fish, and with walrus and seal. Everyone along the whole coast was happy. Ask yourselves, is it not so? The angakok seemed very much pleased with himself, and he looked about, as if he expected everyone else to be pleased with him too. All the people were filled with wonder at his great power. They began to talk among themselves. Yes, I remember the famine well, said Coco's father. I was away up the coast that season. Several died in our village for lack of food. Other men remembered things about other times, when food had been scarce. It is lucky, they said to each other, that here we have a great angakok who understands all the secrets of the world, and who can save us from such dreadful things. 4. At last, Keshu said, Will you tell us, great angakok, how you make these wonderful journeys? Do you really wish to know? Asked the angakok. If you do, I will summon my guiding spirits to tell you, but they will speak only in the darkness. Keshu took the lamp at once and put it out in the tunnel. Then he placed a thick musk ox hide over the entrance, so that not a single ray of light came into the room. The darkness could almost be felt. Everybody sat very still and listened. Soon a heavy body was heard to strike the floor with a dull thud, and a strange voice said, Who calls me? Another voice said, You are called, mighty spirits, to tell these children of the labors of their angakok. Then began all sorts of strange noises, as of different persons speaking. All the voices sounded much like the angakoks, and they all said what a great medicine man the angakok was, and how everyone in the village must be sure to do what he told them to. At last the angakok himself spoke, in his own voice. I will tell you how I make these strange journeys, he said. My body is now lying on the floor at your feet. Now I begin to rise. You cannot see me. You cannot touch me. Now I am floating about your heads. Now I am touching the roof. I can go wherever I please. Nothing can stop me. I know the secret places of the sun, moon, and stars. It's in 30 years. What's kind of reese? I can fly through the roof, and go at once to the moon, if I wish to. Then the voice was still. Nobody moved or spoke. Mani had gone to sleep in the corner of the bed, but Coco and Manet were still awake. They had listened to every word about the old woman of the sea, and how the angakok traveled to the moon. You know I told you before that Coco was 6. He wanted to know all about things, so he spoke right out in the dark when everyone else was still. He said, Mother, if the angakok can go anywhere he wants to, why couldn't he get out of the tunnel? Coco's mother tried to hush him up, "Shh, shh," she said, and put her hand over his mouth. At least she thought she did, but she made a mistake in the dark and put her hand over Maney's mouth instead. Maney tried to say, "I never said a word," but he could only make queer sounds because Coco's mother's hand was tight on his mouth. Of course, Coco didn't know his mother was trying to keep him still, so he said again, "Why is it, Mother?" Coco's mother heard Coco's voice speaking just as plainly as ever, though she was sure she had her hand over his mouth. She was frightened. "Magic! Magic!" she screamed. "Bring the light! Coco is bewitched. I have my hand over his mouth, yet you hear that he talks as plainly as ever." Coco tried to say, "Your hand isn't over my mouth," and Maney tried to say, "It's over mine," but he could only say, "Mum, mum," because she held on so tight. Coco's mother was making so much noise herself that she wouldn't have heard what either one said anyway. The baby woke up and whimpered. Nip and Tup woke up and barked like everything. Keshu got the light from the tunnel as quickly as he could and set it on the bench. Then everyone saw what was the matter. They all laughed, all but Maney and the Angakok. The Angakok said to Coco's father, "You'd better look after that boy. He is disrespectful to me. That is a bad beginning." Coco's father was ashamed of him. He said, "Coco is so small." But the Angakok said, "Coco is 6. He is old enough to know better." 5. Everybody was so glad to see the light again that they all began to talk at once. Someone said to Keshu, "Tell us about the long journey to the south you took once long ago." Then everybody else listened, while Keshu told about how once he had taken his dog sledge with a load of musk ox and seal skins on it far down the coast, and how at last he had come to a little settlement where the houses were all made of wood, if they would believe it. He told them that in the bay before the village there was a boat as big as the big rock itself. It had queer white wings, and the wind blew on these wings and made the boat go. Keshu had been out in a kayak to see it. He had even paddled all round it. The men on the great boat had fair hair, and one of them, the chief man of all, had bought some of Keshu's skins and one of his dogs. The man was a great chief. His name was Nansen. This great chief had told Keshu that he was going to take a sledge and go straight into the inland country where the giants live. He said he was going to cross the great ice. No man had ever done that since the world began. Keshu thought probably the great chief had been eaten by the giants, but he did not know surely, because he had never been back there since to find out. And to be sure, if he had been eaten by giants, no one ever would know about it anyway. Then Keshu showed them all a great knife that the white chief had given him in exchange for a sealskin, and 2 steel needles that he had sent to Cooley. Cooley kept the needles in a little ivory case all by themselves. She always carried the case in her hammock so it would not be lost. She could do wonderful sewing with the needles. Cooley was very proud of her sewing. No one else in the whole village could sew so well, because they had not such good needles to do it with. At last the Angakok said, "It is time to go home." He called to his wives. They climbed down off the bench. That started the others. One after another they put on their upper garments, which they had taken off in the warm igloo, said goodbye, and popped down into the tunnel. Last of all came the Angakok's turn. Then Keshu and Cooley and the Angakok's wives all began to look very anxious. The Angakok looked a little worried himself. If he had stuck coming in, what would happen now after he had eaten so much? He got down on his hands and knees and looked at the hole. He had taken off his thick fur coat when he came in. Now he took off his undercoat and his thick fur trousers. He gave them to his wives. Then he stretched himself out just as long as he possibly could and slowly hitched himself down into the tunnel, groaning all the way. Keshu and Cooley and the wives waited until his feet disappeared, and they heard him scraping along through the tunnel. Then they breathed a great sigh of relief, and the 2 wives popped down after him. The last Keshu and Cooley heard of the Angakok was a kind of muffled roar when a piece of ice fell from the top of the tunnel onto his bare back. Maney and Mani and the pups were already sound asleep in their corner of the bench when their father and mother fixed the lamp for the night and crawled in among the fur robes beside them. VI. The Reindeer Hunt. The Reindeer Hunt. 1. The day after the feast it was still very cold, but there were signs of spring in the air. When Many went out to feed the dogs, he saw a flock of ravens flying north, and Coco saw some seabirds on the same day. 2 days after that, when the twins and Coco were all three playing together on the big rock, they saw a huge iceberg float lazily by. It had broken away from a glacier farther north and was drifting slowly toward the southern sea. It gleamed in the sun like a great ice palace. One morning the air was thick with fog. When Keshu saw the fog, he said this would be a great day to hunt reindeer. "Oh, let me go with you," cried Many. Moni knew better than to ask. She knew very well she would never be allowed to go. Keshu thought a little before he answered. Then he said, "If Coco's father will go, too, you and Coco may both go with us. You are pretty small to go hunting, but boys cannot begin too early to learn." Mani was wild with joy. He rushed to Coco's house and told him and his father what Keshu had said. When he had finished, Coco's father said at once, "Tell Keshu we will go." It was not long before they were ready to start. Keshu had his great bow and arrows and a spear. He also had his bird dart. Coco's father had his bow and spear and dart too. Keshu put a harness on Tuki and tied the end of Tuki's harness trace around Mani's waist. Coco's father had brought his best dog too, and Coco was fastened to the end of that dog's harness in the same way. Then the 4 hunters started on their journey, Mani and Coco driving the dogs in front of them. Mani stood on the big rock and watched them until they were out of sight in the fog. Nip and Tup were with her. They wanted to go as much as Mani did, and she had hard work to keep them from following after the hunters. 2. Keshu knew very well where to look for the reindeer. He led the way up a steep gorge where the first green moss appeared in the spring. They all 4 walked quietly along for several miles. When they got nearly to the head of the gorge, Keshu stopped. He said to the boys, "You must not make any noise yourselves, and you must not let the dogs bark. If you do, there will be no reindeer today." The boys kept very still indeed. The dogs were good hunting dogs. They knew better than to bark. They walked on a little farther. Then Keshu came very near the others and spoke in a low voice. He said, "We are coming to a spot where there are likely to be reindeer. The wind is from the south. If we keep on in this direction, the reindeer will smell us. We must go round in such a way that the wind will carry the scent from them to us, not from us to them." They turned to the right and went round to the north. They had gone only a short distance in this direction when they found fresh reindeer tracks in the snow. The dogs began to sniff and strain at their harnesses. "They smell the game," whispered Keshu. "Hold on tight. Don't let them run." Mani and Coco held the dogs back as hard as they could. Keshu and Coco's father crept forward with their bows in their hands. The fog was so thick they could not see very far before them. They had gone only a short distance when out of the fog loomed 2 great gray shadows. Instantly the 2 men dropped on their knees and took careful aim. The reindeer did not see them. They did not know that anything was near until they felt the sting of the hunter's arrows. One reindeer dropped to the earth. The other was not killed. He flung his head in the air and galloped away, and they could hear the thud, thud of his hoofs long after he had disappeared in the fog. The moment the dogs heard the singing sound of the arrows, they bounded forward. Coco and Mani were not strong enough to hold them back, and they could not run fast enough to keep up with them. So they just bumped along behind the dogs. Some of the time they slid through the snow. The snow was rough and hard, and it hurt a good deal to be dragged through it as if they were sledges, but Eskimo boys are used to bumps, and they knew if they cried, they might scare the game, so they never even whimpered. It was lucky for them that they had not far to go. When they came bumping along, Keshu and Coco's father laughed at them. "Don't be in such a hurry," they called. "There's plenty of time." They unbound the traces from Mani and Coco and hitched the dogs to the body of the reindeer. Then they all started back to the village with Coco's father driving the dogs. Soon the fog lifted and the sky grew clear. Mani was playing with her doll in the igloo when she heard Tuki bark. She knew it was Tuki at once. She and Cooley both plunged into the tunnel like mice down a mouse hole. Nip and Tup were ahead of them. Outside, they found Coco's mother and the baby. Cooley called to her, and she called to the wives of the Ungakuk, who were scraping a bear's skin in the snow. The Angakok's wives and Coco's mother and her baby, and Cooley, and Monny, and Nip, and Top, all ran to meet the hunters, and you never saw two prouder boys than Coco and Minnie when they showed the reindeer to their mothers. The mothers were proud of their young hunters too. Cooley said, "Soon we shall have another man in our family." When they were quite near the village again, they met the Angakok. He had been trying to catch up with them, and he was out of breath from running. "Why didn't you call me?" he panted. His wives looked frightened and didn't say a word. Nobody else said anything. The Angakok glared at them all for a moment. Then he poked the reindeer with his fingers to see if it was fat, and said to the men, "Which portion am I to have?" "Would you like the liver?" asked Keshu. He remembered about the bear's liver, you see. But the Angakok looked offended. "Who will have the stomach?" he said. "You know very well that the stomach is the best part of a reindeer." "Take the stomach, by all means then," said Keshu politely. Cooley and Monny looked very much disappointed. They wanted the stomach dreadfully. But the Angakok answered, "Since you urge me, I will take the stomach. I had a dream last night, and in the dream I was told by my Tornak that today I should feed upon a reindeer's stomach given me by one of my grateful children. When you think how I suffered to bring food to you, I am sure you will wish to provide me with whatever it seems best that I should have." He stood by while Keshu and Coco's father skinned the reindeer and cut it in pieces. Then he took the stomach and disappeared into his igloo, with his face all wreathed in smiles. What happened when Minnie and Coco went hunting by themselves? What happened when Minnie and Coco went hunting by themselves? 1. It was very lucky for the twins that their father was such a brave and skillful kayak man. You will see the reason why when I tell you the story of the day Minnie and Coco went hunting alone on the ice. One April morning, Keshu was working on his kayak to make sure that it was in perfect order for the spring walrus hunting. Coco and Minnie watched him for a long time. By and by, Coco said to Minnie, "Let's go out on the ice and hunt for seal holes." "All right," said Minnie. "You take your bow and arrows, and I'll take my spear. Maybe we shall see some little auks." Coco had a little bow made of deer's horns and some bone arrows, and Minnie had a small spear which his father had made for him out of driftwood. "I'll tell you," said Minnie. "Let's go hunting just the way Father does. You do the shooting, and I'll do the spearing. And won't everybody be surprised to see us bring home a great load of game? I shall give everything I get to my mother." "I'm going to hunt birds and seal holes too," Coco answered. Keshu was very busy fixing the fastening of his harpoon, and he did not hear what they said. The two boys went to their homes for their weapons and then ran out on the ice. Nobody knew where they were. Of course, Nip and Tup went along. 2. All the way over the ice they looked for seal holes. It takes sharp eyes to find them, for seal holes are very small. You see, the mother seals try to find the safest place they can to hide their babies, and this is the way they do it. As soon as the ice begins to freeze in the autumn, the seals gnaw holes in it to reach the air, and they keep these holes open all winter. It freezes so fast in that cold country that they have to be busy almost every minute, all through the winter breaking away the ice there. They get their sleep in snatches of a minute or so at a time, and between their naps they clear the ice from their breathing holes. There is usually a deep layer of snow over the ice. Each mother seal hollows out a little igloo under the snow around her breathing hole and leaves a tiny hole in the top of it, so her baby can have plenty of fresh air and be hidden from sight at the same time. The mother seal leaves the baby in the snow house, and she herself dives through the hole and swims away. Every few minutes she comes back to breathe and to see that her baby is safe. It was the tiny hole in the top of the seal's snow house that Menya and Coco hoped to find. The days had grown quite long by this time, and there was fog in the air. Once in a while there would be a loud crackling noise. "The ice is beginning to break," Coco said. "Don't you hear it pop? My father says he thinks the warm weather will begin early this year." They had gone some distance out on the ice when suddenly Minnie said, "Look, look there!" He pointed toward the north. There, not far from shore, was a flock of seabirds resting on the ice. "Just let me get a shot at them," cried Coco. "You stay here and hold on to the dogs. Nip and Tup haven't any sense at all about game. They'll only scare them." 3. Coco ran swiftly and quietly towards the birds. Many sat on the ice and watched him and held Nip and Tup, one under each arm. When Coco got quite near the birds, he took careful aim and let fly an arrow at them. It didn't hit any of the birds, but it frightened them. They flew up into the air and away to the north and alighted farther on. Coco followed them. All at once, Many heard a queer little sound. It went plop, 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 and it sounded very near. Nip and Tup sniffed and began to growl and nose around on the ice. Many knew what the queer noise meant, for his father had told him all about seal hunting. It meant that a seal hole was near, and that a seal had come up to breathe. It was the seal that made the plopping noise. Many tried to keep the dogs still, but they wouldn't be kept still. They ran round with their noses on the snow, giving little anxious whines and short, sharp barks. The plop, plop stopped. The seal had gone down under the ice, but Many meant to find the hole. He went out quite near the open water in his search. At last, just beyond a hummock of ice, he saw it. He crept carefully up to it. He lay down on his stomach and peeped into the hole to see what it was like. He could not see a thing. Then he stuck his lance down. His lance touched something soft that wiggled. Many stood up. He was so excited that he trembled. He knew he had found a seal hole with a live seal in the snow house. With all his strength he struck his lance down through the snow. The snow house fell in, and Many fell with it, but he kept hold of his lance. The end of the lance was buried in the snow, but it was moving. Many knew by this that he had stuck it into the seal. He lay still and kept fast hold of his lance, and pressed down on it with all his might. Nip and Tup were crazy with excitement. They jumped round and barked and tried to dig a hole in the snow with their forefeet. At last the spear stopped wiggling. Then Many carefully dug the snow away. There lay a little white seal. It was too young to swim away with its mother. That was why such a small boy as Many had been able to kill it. He dragged it out on the ice. He was so excited and so busy he did not notice how near he was to the open water. 4. All of a sudden there was a loud cracking noise, and Many felt the ice moving under him. He looked back. There was a tiny strip of blue water between him and the shore. The strip grew wider while he looked at it. Many knew that he was adrift on an ice raft, and he was terribly frightened. Nip and Tup cuddled close to him and whined with fear. Many understood perfectly well that he might be carried far out to sea and never come back any more. He put his hands to his mouth and yelled with all his might. Coco was still following the birds, and did not hear Many's cries. Many could see him running up the beach after the birds, and he could see his father working over his kayak near his home. He even saw Many come out of the tunnel and go to watch her father at his work. They seemed very far away, and every moment the distance between them and the raft grew greater. Many screamed again and again. At the third scream he saw his father straighten up, shade his eyes with his hand, and look out to sea. "Oh," Many thought, "what if he shouldn't see me?" He shouted louder than ever. He waved his arms. He even pinched the tails of Nip and Tup and made them bark. Then he saw his father wave his hand and dive into the tunnel. In another instant he was out again and pulling on his skin coat. Then he took the kayak on his shoulders and ran with it to the beach. Mani and Cooley came running after him. They were doing the screaming now. Everyone in the village heard the screams and came running down to the beach too. When Many saw his father coming with the kayak, he wasn't afraid anymore, for he was sure his father would save him. He wasn't even afraid about the cakes of ice that were floating in the water, though there is nothing more dangerous than to go out in a kayak among ice floes. One bump from a floating cake of ice is enough to upset any boat, and I don't like to think of what might happen if a kayak should get between two big cakes of ice. Keshu ran with his kayak as far as he could on the ice. Then he got in and fitted the bottom of his skin jacket over the kayak hole and carefully slid himself into the open water. Once in the water, how his paddle flew! It seemed to Many as if his father would never reach him. He sat very still on the ice pan with the dead seal beside him, and Nip and Tup huddled up against him. At last Keshu came near enough so he could make Meanie hear everything he said. "Meanie," he cried, "if you do exactly what I tell you to, I can save you. I will throw you my harpoon. You must drive it way down into the ice. Then, by the harpoon line, I will tow your ice pan back toward shore. When we get to the big ice, I will find a place for you to land. You must be ready, and when I give the word jump from your ice raft on to the solid ice." Then Keshu threw his harpoon, and Many drove it into the ice with all his might. Slowly Keshu drew the line taut, turned his kayak round, and started for the shore. The journey out had been dangerous, but the journey back was much more so, for Keshu could not dodge the floating ice nearly so well. He had to pick his way carefully through the clearest water he could find. Very cautiously they moved toward shore. 5. They were getting quite near the place where the ice had broken with Menye, when suddenly, right near them, they saw the head and great round eyes of a seal. It was the seal mother. She had come back to find her breathing hole and her baby. The moment Keshu saw her, he seized his dart, which lay in its place on top of his kayak, and threw it with all his might at the seal. The seal dived down into the sea, but a bladder full of air was attached to the line on the dart, and this bladder floated on the water, so Keshu could tell by watching it just where the seal was. Keshu knew he had struck the seal, and although he was already towing the ice raft, he was determined to bring home the big seal too. He called to Many, "Sit still and wait until I come for you." Then he quickly cut the harpoon line by which he was towing the ice raft and set it adrift again. As soon as he was free, he paddled away after the bladder, which was now bobbing along over the water at some little distance from the boat. Manye sat perfectly still and watched his father. Keshu reached the bladder and began to pull on the line, but just at that moment the big seal turned round and swam right under the kayak. In a second the kayak turned bottom side up in the water, Many screamed. The people watching on the shore gave a great howl, and Coco's father started up the beach after his own kayak. He thought perhaps Keshu could not manage both the ice raft and the seal, and he meant to go to help him. But in 1 second, Keshu was right side up again. No water could get into the kayak because Keshu's skin coat was drawn tight over the hole in the deck, and Keshu was in the coat. Keshu often turned somersaults in the water in that way. Sometimes he even did it for fun. He said afterward that he could have turned the boat right side up again with just his nose, without using either his paddle or his arms, if only his nose had been a little bigger, and though he meant this for a joke, the twins believed that he really could do it. The moment he was right side up again, Keshu gave chase once more to the bladder. The seal was very weak now, and Keshu knew that it would soon come to the surface and float, and that then he could tow it in. He had not long to wait. The bladder bobbed about for a while, and then was still. Keshu drew up the line and paddled back to the ice raft, towing the big seal after him. "Catch this," he said to Menier. He threw him the end of the line. "Wind the line 6 times round the harpoon," he said, "and hold tight to the end of it." Many did as he was told. Then Keshu tied together the 2 ends of the harpoon line, which he had cut, and began to tow the ice raft back to shore again. Menya kept tight hold of the other line and towed the seal. Keshu paddled slowly and carefully along until at last there was only a little strip of water between the kayak and the solid ice. But how in the world could Menya get across that strip of water to safety? The kayak was between him and the solid ice, and Menya could not possibly get into the kayak, neither could he swim. But Keshu knew a way. He came up closer to the solid ice. Then he gave a great sweep with his paddle and lifted his kayak right up onto it. He sprang out and, seizing the harpoon line, pulled Meny's raft close up to the edge of the firm ice. Meny was still holding tight to the line that held the big seal. Keshu threw him another line. Meny caught the end of it. "Now tie the big seal's line fast to that," Keshu said. Menier was a very small boy, but he knew how to tie knots. He did just what his father told him to. "Now," said his father, "pull up the harpoon." Meny did so. Tie the harpoon line to the little seal." Meny did that. Now, throw the harpoon to me," commanded Keshu. Meny threw it with all his might. His father caught it and stood on the firm ice, holding in his hands the line that the big seal was tied to, and the harpoon with its line fastened to the little seal. "Now hold on to the little seal, and I will pull you right up against the solid ice, and when I say jump, you jump," said Keshu. Slowly and very carefully he pulled, until the raft grated against the solid ice. "Jump!" shouted Keshu. Meny jumped. The ice raft gave a lurch that nearly sent him into the water, but Keshu caught him and pulled him to safety. A great shout of joy went up from the shore, and Many was glad enough to shout too when he felt solid ice under his feet once more. While he helped his father pull in the little seal, all the people came running out onto the ice to meet them. But Keshu sent back everyone except Coco's father. He was afraid the ice might break again with so many people on it. Coco's father helped pull the big seal out of the water and over the ice to the beach. Many dragged his own little seal after him by the harpoon line, and when he came near the beach, the people all cried out, "See the great hunter with his game!" And Cooley was so glad to see Many and so proud of her boy that she nearly burst with joy. "I knew the charm would work," she cried. "Not only does he spy bears, he kills seals, and he only 5 years old." She put her arms around him and pressed her flat nose to his. That's the Eskimo way of kissing. Many tried to look as if he killed seals and got carried away on an ice pan every day in the week, but inside he felt very proud too. When Keshu and Coco's father came up with the big seal, Cooley and the other women dragged it to the village, where it was skinned and cut up. Everyone had a piece of raw blubber to eat at once, and the very first piece went to Meanie. While they were eating it, Coco came back. He had gone so far up the shore hunting little auks that he hadn't seen a thing that had happened. And he hadn't killed any little auks either. Coco felt that things were very unequally divided in this world. He wanted to kill a seal and get lost on a raft and be a hero too. But Cooley gave him a large piece of blubber, and that made him feel much more cheerful again. He just said to Mani, "If I had been with Meanie, this never would have happened. I should not have let him get so near the edge of the ice. But then, I am 6 and he is only 5, so, of course, he didn't know any better." Everybody in the village had seal meat that night, and the Ungacock had the head, which they all thought was the best part. He said he didn't feel very well, and his Tornak had told him nothing would cure him so quickly as a seal's head. So Cooley gave it to him. The skin of the little white seal Cooley saved and dressed very carefully. She chewed it, all over, on the wrong side, and sucked out all the blubber, and made it soft and fine as velvet. And when that was done, she made out of it 2 beautiful pairs of white mittens for the twins. VII, the woman boats. The woman boats. 1. During the long, dark hours of the winter, Keshu found many pleasant things to do at home. He was always busy. He carved a doll for Mani out of the ivory tusk of a walrus. Mani named the doll Anador, and she loved it dearly. Cooley dressed Anador in fur with tiny kamiks of sealskin, and Mani carried her doll in her hood, just the way Coco's mother carried her baby. For Menya, his father made dog harnesses out of walrus hide. He made them just the right size for Nip and Tup. Many harnessed the little dogs to his sled. Then he and Mani would play sledge journeys. Anador would sit on the sled all wrapped in furs, while Many drove the dogs and Mani followed after. Nip and Tup did not like this play very well, and they didn't always go where they were told to. Once they dashed right over the igloo and spilled Anador off. Anador rolled down one side of the igloo, while Nip and Tup galloped down the other. Anador was buried in the snow and had to be dug out, so it was quite a serious accident, you see, but Nip and Tup did not seem to feel at all responsible about it. Keshu made knives and queer spoons out of bone or ivory for Cooley, and for himself he made new barbs for his bladder dart, new bone hooks for fish lines, and all sorts of things for hunting. He made salmon spears and bird darts and fish lines, and he ornamented his weapons with little pictures or patterns. He carved 2 frogs on the handle of his snow knife and scratched the picture of a walrus on the blade. Sometimes Cooley carved things too, but most of the time she was busy making coats or kamiks, or chewing skins to make them soft and fine for use in the igloo, or to cover the kayaks, or to make their summer tent. Once during the winter, the whole family went 30 miles up the coast by moonlight to visit Cooley's brother in another village. They went with the dog sledge, and it took them 2 days. They had meat and blubber with them and plenty of warm skins, and when they got tired, Keshu made a snow house for them to rest in. The twins thought this was the best fun of all. 2. When spring came on, there were other things to do. As the days grew longer, the ice in the bay cracked and broke into small pieces and floated away. The water turned deep blue and danced in the sunlight, and ice floated about in it. Often there were walrus on these ice pans. The twins sometimes saw their huge black bodies on the white ice and heard their hoarse barks. Then all the men in the village would rush for their kayaks and set out after the walrus. The men were brave and enjoyed the dangerous sport, but the women used to watch anxiously until they saw the kayaks coming home towing the walrus behind them. Then they would rush down to the shore, help pull the kayaks up on the beach, where they cut the walrus in pieces and divided it among the families of the hunters. When the snow had melted on the big rock, hundreds of seabirds made their nests there and filled the air with their cries. Sometimes Cashew went egg hunting on the cliff, and sometimes he set traps there for foxes, and he helped Minnie and Coco make a little trap to catch hares. There was plenty to do in every season of the year. At last the nights shortened to nothing at all. The long day had begun. The stone, but which they had found so comfortable in winter, seemed dark and damp now. Minnie and Money remembered the summer days when they did not have to dive down through a hole to get into their house. So Minnie said to Money one day, "Let's go and ask Father if it isn't time to put up the tents." They ran out to find him. He was down on the beach talking with Coco's father and the other men of the village. On the beach were two very long boats. The men were looking them over carefully to see if they were watertight. Coco was with the men. When he saw the twins coming, he tore up the slope to meet them, waving his arms and shouting, "They're getting out the woman boats! They're getting out the woman boats!" This was glorious news to the twins. They ran down to the beach with Coco as fast as their legs could carry them. They got there just in time to hear Coco's father say to Keshu, "I think it's safe to start. The ice is pretty well out of the bay, and the reindeer will be coming down to the fjords after fresh moss." All the men listened to hear what Keshu would say, and the twins listened too, with all their ears. "If it's clear, I think we could start after one more sleep," said Keshu. 3. The twins didn't wait to hear any more. They flew for home and dashed down the tunnel and up into the room. Cooley was gathering all the knives and spoons and fishing things and sewing things and dumping them into a large musk ox hide which was spread on the floor. The musk ox hide covered the entrance hole. The first thing Cooley knew something thumped the musk ox skin on the underside, and the knives and thimbles and needle cases and other things flew in all directions. Up through the hole popped the faces of Minnie and Money. "Oh, Mother," they shouted, "we're going off on the woman boats." After only one more sleep. "If it's pleasant. Father said so." Cooley laughed. "I know it," she said. "I was just packing. You can help me. There's a lot to do to get ready." The twins were delighted to help. They got together all their own treasures, the sled and the fishing rods, the dog harnesses and Anador, and bound them up with walrus thongs. All but Anador. Anador rode in Money's hood as usual. Cooley gathered all her things together again and wrapped them in the musk ox hide. She took down the long narwhal tusks that the dog harnesses were hung on. These were the tent poles. She and the twins carried all these things to the beach. The men stayed on the beach and packed the things away in the boats. The other women brought down their bundles from their igloos. There was room for everything in the two big boats. Only the skins were left on the sleeping bench in the hut. When everything else was ready, Cooley and the twins went up on top of the igloo. They pulled the moss and dirt out of the chinks between the stones that made the roof, and then Cooley pulled up the stones themselves and let them fall over to one side. This left the roof open to the sky. "What makes you do that?" Minnie asked. "So the sun and rain can clean house for us," said Cooley. Everybody else in the village got ready in the same way. At last Keshu came up from the beach and said to Cooley, "Let us have some meat and a sleep, and then we will start. Everything is ready. The boats are packed, and it looks as if the weather would be clear." Cooley brought out some walrus meat and blubber for supper, though it might just as well be called breakfast, for there was no night coming, and the twins ate theirs sitting on the roof of the igloo, with their feet hanging down inside. Once Menia's feet kicked his father's head. It was an accident, but Keshu reached up and took hold of Menia's foot and pulled him down onto the sleeping bench and rolled him over among the skins. "Crawl in there and go to sleep," he said. Money let herself down through the roof by her hands and crept in beside Meni. Then Keshu and Cooley wrapped themselves in the warm skins and lay down too. It took Meni and Money some time to go to sleep, for they could look straight up through the roof at the sky, and the sky was bright and blue with little white clouds sailing over it. Besides, they were thinking about the wonderful things that would happen when they should wake up. Ix. The voyage. The voyage. 1. When the twins awoke, the sun was shining as brightly as ever, and Nip and Tup were barking at them through the hole in the roof. Keshu and Cooley were gone. Minnie and Money were frightened. They were afraid they were left behind. They sat up in bed and howled. In a moment Cooley's face looked down at them through the roof. "What's the matter?" she said. "We thought we were left," wailed Money. "As if I could leave you behind," cried Cooley. She laughed at them. "Hunt up the skins to me," she said. She reached her arm down the hole and pulled out all the skins from the bed as fast as the twins gave them to her. Then she put her head down into the opening and looked all around. "We haven't left a thing," she said. "Come along." The twins couldn't climb out through the roof, though they wanted to, so they went out by the tunnel and helped their mother carry the skins to the beach. All the people in the village and all the dogs were there before them. The great woman boats were packed. The kayaks of the men waited beside them in a row on the beach, with their noses in the water. The dogs barked and raced up and down the beach. The babies crowed, and the children shouted for joy. Even the grown people were gay. They talked in loud tones and laughed and made jokes. 2. At last Keshu shouted, "All ready, in you go!" He told each person where to sit. He put the angakok in one boat to steer. He put Coco's father in the other. In Coco's father's boat, he placed Coco and his mother and the baby, Cooley and the twins, the pups, all 3 dogs, and 4 of the women who lived in the other igloos. So you see it was quite a large boat. In the angakok's boat he placed his 2 wives, and all the rest of the women and children and dogs. The women took up the paddles. One end of the boat was partly in the water when they got in. The men gently pushed it farther out until it floated. Then the men got into their kayaks at the water's edge, fastened their skin coats over the rims, and paddled out into deep water. At last, when all the boats, big and little, were afloat, Keshu called out, "We are going north, follow me." The women obeyed the signal of Coco's father and the angakok. The paddles dipped together into the water. The great boats moved. They were off. The children all sat together in the bottom of the boat, but the twins and Coco were big enough to see over the sides. While the babies played with the dogs, they were busy watching the things that passed on the shores. Soon, they passed the big rock with little auks and puffins flying about it. They could see the red feet of the puffins and a blue fox sitting on the top of the rock, waiting for a chance to catch a bird. Then, the big rock hid the village from sight. 3. Beyond the big rock, the country was all new to the twins and Coco. They looked into narrow bays and inlets as the boat moved along and saw green moss carpeting the sunny slopes in sheltered places. They could even see bright flowers growing in the warm spots which faced the sun. The sky was blue overhead. The water was blue below. Beyond the green slopes, they could see the bare hillsides crowned with the white ice cap which never melts, and streams of water dashing down the hillsides and pouring themselves into the waters of the bay. When they had gone a good many miles up the coast, Keshu waved his hand and pointed to a strange sight on the shore. There was a great river of ice. They could see where it came out of a hollow place between 2 hills. It looked just like a river, only it was frozen solid, and the end of it, where it came into the sea, was broken off like a great wall of ice, and there were cakes of ice floating about in the water. Suddenly, there was a cracking sound. Minnie had heard that sound before. It was the same sound that he had heard when he went seal hole hunting and got carried away on the ice raft. Minnie didn't like the sound any more. It scared him. Right after the cracking noise, Keshu's voice shouted, "Row farther out. Follow me. Follow me." He turned his kayak straight out to sea. All the other boats followed. They had gone only about half a mile when suddenly there was a loud crick, crick, crack, as if a piece of the world had broken off, and then there was a splash that could be heard for miles, if there had been anyone to hear it. The end of the glacier, or ice river, had broken off and fallen down into the water. It had made an iceberg. The splash was so great that in a moment the waves it made reached the boats. The boats rocked up and down on the water and bounced about like corks. The twins and Coco thought this was great fun, but the angakok didn't like it a bit. One wave splashed over him, and some of the water went down his neck. All the grown people knew that if they hadn't rowed quickly away from shore when Keshu called, they might have been upset and drowned. 4. When the waves made by the iceberg had calmed down again, Keshu paddled round among the boats. He said, "I think we'd better land about a mile above here. There's a stream there, and perhaps we can get some salmon for our dinner." He led the way in his kayak, and all the other boats followed. They kept out of the path of the iceberg, which had already floated some distance from the shore, and it was not long before they came to a little inlet. Keshu paddled into it and up to the very end of it, where a beautiful stream of clear water came dashing down over the rocks into the sea. The hills sloped suddenly down to the shore. The sun shone brightly on the green slopes, and the high cliffs behind shut off the cold north winds. It was a little piece of Somerset right down in the valley. "Oh, how beautiful!" everybody cried. The boats were soon drawn up on the beach, the women and children tumbled out, and then began preparations for dinner. The women got out their cooking pots, and coolly set to work to make a fireplace out of 3 stones. They had blubber and moss with them, but how could they get a fire? They had no matches. They had never even heard of a match. The Angakok sat down on the beach. He had some little pieces of dried driftwood and some dried moss. He held one end of a piece of driftwood in a sort of handle which he pressed against his lips. The other end was in a hollow spot in another piece of wood. The Angakok rolled one driftwood stick round and round in the hollow spot of the other. He did this by means of a bow which he pulled from one side to the other. This made the stick whirl first one way, then back again. Soon a little smoke came curling up round the stick. Coolie dropped some dried moss on the smoking spot. Suddenly there was a little blaze. She fed the little flame with more moss, and then lighted the moss on the stones of the fireplace. She put a soapstone kettle filled with water over the fire, and soon the kettle was boiling. While all this was going on down on the beach, the men took their salmon spears and went up the river, and Coco and the twins went with them. The wives of the Angakok went to find moss to feed the fire. They brought back great armfuls of it and put it beside the fireplace. Coolie was the cook. She stayed on the beach and looked after the babies and the dogs and the fire. Everything was ready for dinner, except the food. Meanwhile, the men had found a good place where there were big stones in the river. They stood on these stones with their spears in their hands. There were hundreds of salmon in the little stream. The salmon were going up to the little lake from which the river flowed. When the fish leaped in the water, the men struck at them with their fish spears. There were so many fish, and the men were so skillful that they soon had plenty for dinner. They strung them all on a walrus line and went back to the beach. Coolie popped as many as she could into her pot to cook, but the men were so hungry they ate theirs raw, and the twins and Coco had as many fish's eyes to eat as they wanted for once in their lives. When everybody had eaten as much as he could possibly hold, the babies were rolled up in furs in the sand and went to sleep. The Angakok lay down on the sand in the sunshine with his hands over his stomach and was soon asleep too. The men sat in a little group nearby, and Many and Coco lay on their stomachs beside Keshu. The women had gone a little farther up the beach. The air was still, except for the rippling sound of the water, the distant chatter of the women, the snores of the Angakok, and the buzzing of mosquitoes. For quite a long time, everybody rested. Many and Coco didn't go to sleep. They were having too much fun. They played with shells and pebbles and watched the mosquitoes buzzing over the Angakok's face. There were a great many mosquitoes, and they seemed to like the Angakok. At last, one settled on his nose, and bit and bit. Many and Coco wanted to slap it, but of course they didn't dare. They just had to let it bite. All of a sudden, the Angakok woke up and slapped it himself. He slapped it harder than he intended to. He looked very much surprised and quite offended about it. He sat up and looked round for his wives, as if he thought perhaps they had something to do with it. But they were at the other end of the beach. The Angakok yawned and rubbed his nose, which was a good deal swollen. Just then Keshu spoke. "I think we shall look a long time before we find a better spot than this to camp," he said. "Here are plenty of salmon. We can catch all we need to dry for winter use right here. There must be deer farther up the fjord. What do you say to setting up the tents right here?" When Keshu said anything, the others were pretty sure to agree, because Keshu was such a brave and skillful man that they trusted his judgment. All the men said, "Yes, let us stay." Then the angakok said, "Yes, my children, let us stay. While you thought I was asleep here on the sand, I was really in a trance. I thought it best to ask my tornak about this spot, and whether we should be threatened here by any hidden danger. My tornak says to stay." This settled the matter. "Tell the women," said Keshu. Koko's father went over to the place where the women and children were. "Get out the tent poles," he called to them. "Here's where we stay." 5. The women jumped up and ran to the woman boats. They got out the long narwhal tusks and the skins and set them down on the beach. "Come with me," Cooley called to the twins. She gave them each a long tent pole to carry. She herself carried the longest pole of all and a pile of skins. Cooley led the way up the green slope to a level spot overlooking the stream and the bay. It was beside some high rocks, and there were smaller stones all about. There was a flat stone that she used for the sleeping bench. When the poles were set up and securely fastened, she got the tent skins and covered the poles. She put on one layer of skin with the hair inside, and over that another covering of skin with the fur side out. She sewed the skins together over the entrance with leather thongs and left a flap for a door. Then she placed stones around the edge of the tent covering to keep the wind from blowing it away. She piled the bedskins on the rock, and their summer house was ready. The twins brought the musk ox hides with all their treasures in them, and the cooking pots and knives and household things from the beach, while Cooley made the fireplace in the tent. She made the fireplace by driving 4 sticks into the ground and lashing them together to make a framework. She hung the cooking kettle by straps from the 4 corners. Under the kettle, on a flat stone, she placed the lamp. Then the stove was ready. "We shall cook out of doors most of the time," she said to the twins, "but in rainy weather we shall need the lamp." It was only a little while before there was a whole new village ready to live in, with plenty of fish and good fresh water right at hand. 6. Minnie and Money were happy in their new home. They climbed about on the rock and found a beautiful cave to play in. They gathered flowers and shells and colored stones and brought them to their mother. Then later, they went for more fish with the men, and Keshu let them stand on the stones and try to spear the fish just the way the men did. Menya caught one, and Koko caught one, but Money had no luck at all. "Anyway, I caught a codfish once," Money said, to comfort herself. In 2 hours everything was as settled about the camp as if they had lived there a week, and everyone was hungry again. Hungriness and sleepiness came just as regularly as if they had had nights and clocks both to measure time by. When the food was ready, Keshu called, "Ujo, Ujo," which meant boiled meat, and everybody came running to the beach. The men sat in one circle, the women and children in another. Pots of boiled fish were set in the middle of the circles, and they all dipped in with their fingers and took what they wanted. When everybody had eaten, the children played on the beach. They skipped stones and danced and played ball, and their mothers played with them. The men had their fun, too. They sat in their circle, told stories, and played games which weren't children's games, and the angakok sang a song, beating time on a little drum. All the men sang the chorus. By and by, Cooley saw Money's head nodding, so she said to the twins, "Come, children, let's go up to the tent." She took their hands and led them up the slope. "We're not sleepy," the twins declared. "I am," said Cooley, "and I want you with me." They went into the tent, which was not so light as it was out of doors in the bright sunlight. Then they undressed, crawled in among the deerskins, and were soon sound asleep, all 3 of them. After a while Keshu came up from the beach and went to sleep too. X. The summer day. The summer day. 1. The summer days flew by, only one really shouldn't say days at all, but summer day. For 3 whole bright months it was just one daylight picnic all the time. The people ate when they were hungry and slept when they were sleepy. The men caught hundreds of salmon, and the women split them open and dried them on the rocks for winter use. The children played all day long. The men hunted deer and musk ox and bears up in the hills and brought them back to camp. They hunted game both by land and by sea. There was so much to eat that everybody grew fatter, and as for the angakok, he got so very fat that Koko said to Minnie, "I don't believe we can ever get the angakok home in the woman boat. He's so heavy he'll sink it. I think it would be a good plan to tie a string to him and tow him back like a walrus." "Yes," said Minnie. "Maybe he would shrink some if we soaked him well. Don't you know how water shrinks the walrus hide cords that we tie around things when we want them to hold tight together?" It was lucky for Menya and Coco that nobody heard them say that about the angakok. It would have been thought very disrespectful. When the game grew scarce, or they got tired of camping in one spot, everything was piled into their boats again, and away they went up the coast until they found another place they liked better. Then they would set up their tents again. Sometimes they came to other camps and had a good time meeting new people and making new friends. At last, late in August, the sun slipped down below the edge of the world again. It stayed just long enough to fill the sky with wonderful red and gold sunset clouds. Then it came up again. The next night there was a little time between the sunset sky and the lovely colors of the sunrise. The next night was longer still. Each day grew colder and colder. Still, the people lingered in their tents. They did not like to think the pleasant summer was over and the long night near. But at last Keshu said, "I think it is time to go back to winter quarters. The nights are fast growing longer. The snow may be upon us any day now. I don't know of a better place to settle than the village where we spent last winter. The igloos are all built there ready to use again. What do you say? Shall we go back there?" "Yes, let us go back," they all said. 2. The very next day they started. The boats were heavily loaded with dried fish. There were great piles of new skins heaped in the woman boats, and every kayak towed a seal. For days they traveled along the coast, stopping only for rest and food. The twins and Coco sat in the bottom of the boat with the dogs, and listened to the regular dip of the paddles, to the cries of the seabirds as they flew away toward the south, and to the chatter of the women. These were almost the only sounds they heard, for the silence of the great white world was all about them. They talked together in low voices and planned all the things they would do when the long night was really upon them once more. When at last they came in sight of the big rock, they felt as if they had reached home after a very long journey. Coco stood up in the boat and pointed to it. "See," he cried, "there's the big rock where we found the bear." "Yes," Monty said, "and where we slid downhill." "And I see where I got caught on the ice raft," Minnie shouted. "Sit down," said Coco's mother. "You'll tip the boat and spill us all into the water." Coco sat down. The boat glided along through the water, nearer and nearer, until at last they came round the big rock, and there, just as if they had not been away at all, lay the whole village of 5 igloos, looking as if it had gone to sleep in the sunshine. The big boats waited until the men had all paddled to the shore and beached their kayaks. Then they were drawn carefully up onto the sand, and everyone got out. The beach at once became a very busy place. The men pulled the walruses and seals out of the water and took care of the boats, while the women set up the tents, cut the meat into big pieces for storage, and carried all their belongings to the tents. Although the village looked just the same, other things looked quite different. Nip and Tup were big dogs by this time. They ran away up the beach with Tuki and the other dogs the moment they were out of the boats. They did not stay with the twins all the time now, as they used to do. The twins were much bigger, too. Cooley looked at them as they helped her carry the tent skins up from the beach, and said to them, "My goodness, I must make my needles fly. Winter is upon us, and your clothes are getting too small for you. You must have new things right away." The twins thought this was a very good idea. They liked new clothes, as well as anyone in the world. Cooley set up the tent beside their old igloo, and there they lived while the men of the village went out every day in their kayaks for seal and walrus, or back into the hills after other game to store away for food during the long winter. The women scraped and cured the skins, and cut up the meat, and packed it away as fast as the men could kill the game and bring it home. Each day it grew colder, and each night was longer than the last, until one short September day there came a great snowstorm. It snowed all day long, and that night the wind blew so hard that Cooley and the twins nearly froze even among the fur covers of their bed, and when morning came they found themselves nearly buried under a great drift. That very day Cooley put the stones over the roof of the igloo once more, and the twins helped her fill in the chinks with moss and earth, and cover it with a heavy layer of snow, patted down with the snow shovel, until everything was snug and tight again. Then they moved in. By the next day all the igloos in the village were in use, and when night came their windows shone with the light of the lamps, just as they had so many months before. Nip and Tup slept outside with Tuki now, in a snow house which Keshu had built for them. Minnie and Mani missed them, but Cooley said, "You're getting so big now, you must begin to do something besides play with puppies. Mani must learn to sew, and Minnie must help Father with feeding the dogs and looking after their harnesses and driving the sledge. Maybe Father will teach you both to carve fine things out of ivory this winter. Mani will soon need her own thimble and needles. They must be made, and she can help me clean the skins and suck out the blubber and prepare them for being made into clothes." Dear me, what a lot there is to do to keep clothes on our backs and food in our mouths. The giants are always waiting before the igloo, and we must work very hard to keep them outside. She did not mean real giants. She meant that hunger and want are always waiting to seize the Eskimo, who does not work all the time to supply food for himself and his family. She meant that Mani must learn to be a brave, strong hunter, afraid of nothing on sea or land, and that Mani must learn to do a woman's work well, or else the time would come when they would be without food or shelter or clothing, and the fierce cold would soon make an end of them. It was lucky they got into the warm igloo just when they did, for the winter had come to stay. The bay froze over far out from shore, and the white snow covered the igloo so completely that if it had not been for the windows and for people moving about out of doors, no one could have told that there was any village there. The last day of all was so short that Minnie and Mani and Coco saw the whole of it from the top of the big rock. They had gone up there in the gray twilight that comes before the sunrise to build a snow house to play in. They had been there only a little while when the sky grew all rosy just over the edge of the world. The color grew stronger and stronger until the little stars were all drowned in it, and then up came the great round red face of the sun itself. The children watched it as it peered over the horizon, threw long blue shadows behind them across the snow, and then sank slowly, slowly down again, leaving only the flaming colors in the sky to mark the place where it had been. "Goodbye, old sun," they shouted, "and goodbye, Shadow, too. We shall be glad to see you both when you come back again." Then, because the wind blew very cold and they could see a snow cloud coming toward them from the great white world where the giants lived, the children ran together down the snowy slope toward the bright windows of their homes. The end. Suggestions to teachers. To arouse the children's interest, and thus to make the reading of this story most valuable as a school exercise, it is suggested that at the outset the children be allowed to look at the pictures in the book in order to get acquainted with Minnie and Mani, and with the scenes illustrating their home life and surroundings. During the reading, point out the North Pole, Greenland, etc., on a map of the world or on a globe, and tell the children something about the many years of effort before Peary succeeded in reaching his goal, also about the work of subsequent explorers in this part of the world and around the South Pole as well. Thus, this supplementary reading material may be connected with the work in geography. The text is so simply written that the second-grade child can read it without much or any preparation. It may be well to have the children read it first in a study period in order to work out the pronunciation of the more difficult words. But many classes will be able to read it at sight, without the preparatory study. The possibilities in the story for dramatization and for language and constructive work will be immediately apparent. In connection with the reading of the book, teachers should tell to the children stories describing Eskimo life and the experiences of explorers and pioneers in the North. Grenfell's Adrift on an Ice Pan is suitable, for example. Holbrook's Northland Heroes and Schultz's Sinapa, the Indian Boy, while not belonging to the land of the Eskimos, contain stories of Allied interest. The unique illustrations in The Eskimo Twins should be much used, both in the reading of the story and in other ways. Children will enjoy sketching some of them. Their simple treatment makes them especially useful for this purpose. The book is printed on paper, which will take watercolor well, and where the books are individually owned, some of the sketches could be used for coloring in flat washes. They also afford suggestions for action sketching by the children. An excellent oral language exercise would be for the children, after they have read the story, to take turns telling the story from the illustrations, and a good composition exercise would be for each child to select the illustration that he would like to write upon, make a sketch of it, and write the story in his own words. These are only a few of the many ways that will occur to resourceful teachers for making the book a valuable, as well as an enjoyable exercise in reading. Thanks for listening to The Eskimo Twins by Lucy Fitch Perkins.